Hey everyone, and welcome back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Please catch us on all the usual podcast places and find us at our YouTube channel. Today I'm joined by Shashi and Lakshay, and we're going to be discussing a little bit of tech reviews across media, touch on how Moderna might be using specific GPTs to help accelerate their workflows, and some more things. So, fellas, I want to start kind of with tech reviews. Number one, Shashi, I know that you have ordered the Humane AI Pin. I think as of now, you're still waiting for receipt of that device, but I'm seeing a few reviews across tech for the Humane AI Pin, for Devin, the artificially intelligent software engineer. So I just kind of want to set the stage and have a brief discussion, or maybe an extended discussion, on tech reviews. Kind of what is their place in the ecosystem as builders of technology. We are sometimes, I think there's a boost and a detriment to some tech reviews and kind of the subjective experiences of the reviewer. So, Shashi, I'll start with you, just given that you have the Humane AI Pin. So, I don't know if you saw reviews by Marquise Brownlee, who is a very prominent YouTube reviewer, and others kind of shedding a not so favorable light on the Humane AI Pin. So, a couple questions to you. Number one, how much do you care about external reviews? How much do you think that's going to shape the experiences you may or may not have with the product? And has it kind of, increased or decreased your enthusiasm for the product overall?
I really like Marquise Brownlee. I think he's a fantastic reviewer. He's got a great presence and a way of explaining products in a way that feels relatable. So I think there's a market for reviews. I think there are lots of people like me who want to find out information about products, potentially before buying them, or potentially before receiving them in the mail. I still haven't received my Humane Pin yet, so I did watch his review, and I thought it was really useful. I've also seen all the company produced content about their own product, and I think in terms of the features, I think Marquise presents it in a very fair way. What are the actual features of this product? I think the interpretation is then how well do they work? How fast do they work? How useful is the product? And so I thought his review, specifically of this product, and then we can expand out to kind of reviews generally. His review of this product was helpful in setting expectations for what it can and can't do. The original impetus for the device was to be a phone replacement. I think that is now proving to be non-optimal. I think it would be better positioned as a supplement to a phone, at least for some significant period of time, some number of years, before it can function as a standalone with potentially a much better projector on the hand, a much better audio interface, etc. Lower latency primarily as one of the key concerns. So all of that is to say, I thought the review, he clearly just depicted the features. I thought it was fair in the way he described that, and I think his concerns are all legitimate. I'm still excited about getting the product and using it. I don't see it as a phone replacement. I see it as a complementary device. I really like the idea of experimentation in hardware, consumer tech, and I'm glad that Humane has made that investment. I hope many others do too. And I, as an early adopter of hardware, I'd like the idea of supporting those early ventures, knowing not all of them are going to pan out to be great tech, at least on first pass.
Actually, do you have any thoughts with specific regards to the Humane AI Pin? And then, Shashi, I want to return to the hardware ecosystem of it all, because I think there's some interesting threads to pull on there too.
Yeah, I think like even with something like the iPhone, like people have been trying something like that since like the 90s. Like you hear about the idea of like the pocket crystal, and it never really took off until Apple pulled it off correctly. I think where I'm kind of going with that is that like this feels like the first gen of these sort of like hardware AI like micro products. I don't know how to correctly describe them, but in the space of like wearables, right? And so I think like everything he kind of described in the demo or like in the review, like I think made a lot of sense intuitively, right? You have to worry about the battery, you have to worry about the heat. Like there's emergent issues when you just like have a lot of compute that's regularly serving like close to a phone style product and putting it in a much smaller form factor. And now it has magnetics, it has a projector in it, right? I feel like in general, like I'm still pretty enthusiastic, I guess. I don't know if I would be a user of the first generation, but like I think the fact that we are able to put out a first generation that's usable as a product to some capacity is a good sign. Um, like even with the Rabbit R1, I think I don't know if they call that a pin either, but even with that, like there's been a lot of like pretty like I don't know controversial, but like skeptical like content being put out in the world about like oh like this like large like agentic model that they're putting on the internet, it's only set to do like 4 websites and that's all it can do, right? Um, I think what the reviewer like economy I guess really does that, like this is first gen and it's very clearly showing like okay we've built like cool tech, what is the important piece for the human part of this product, right? Like how do you make this something that's like a lovable experience that stands out and like has a place in your memory, rather than just like okay we got cool laser projector, we got cool small form factor, we got GPT-4 inside of it, which I feel like oftentimes in just the space of engineering driven companies can oftentimes be misprioritized of just like we build cool technology first, we put it out there into the world and hope people like the vision of what we had. So we'll get there, I think. I feel like it's not that far away. Like what you need to solve is like a lot of latency issues and accuracy issues, and if it can get there it might earn its spot a little bit faster.
Yeah, I think all that is right. The thread that I kind of wanted to pull on with that Shashi closed with is this idea of being a startup, especially specifically in the hardware space in kind of today's time. And the stage that I kind of want to set for this discussion is because smartphones today are so great. The baseline standard for new hardware devices that are even smartphone adjacent, we can think about Apple Vision Pro, Meta Quest, and now like these AI kind of devices, pins or otherwise. They are directly competing, at least in the consumer headspace, with smartphones that have had decades to build on early successes. And so I do think there is a pretty high risk in anything that is kind of at least somewhat analogous to a smartphone entering today's market because of those things. And so I do think that there is sometimes a lack of enthusiasm around the receipt of these products because people intuitively compare them to these very, very powerful smartphone devices, right? They're not remembering the earliest days of the iPhone with no app store and barely usable internet connection, if any at all, right? Those are not the kind of images and the thoughts that are being evoked. They're just simply considered doing an A/B test to their present day iPhone or Android device, which is obviously far superior to these kind of early stage devices. And so I want to pause there just for comment and feedback on that. But then I think there's a larger point that I eventually want to get to, which is how do you exist as a hardware startup given those constraints? How do you effectively raise capital? How do you effectively get to market and test your ideas without dying, so to speak? So I'm going to pause there and we'll return to that. But then, Shashi, if you would just maybe comment on kind of the juxtaposition of new devices entering the marketplace compared to present day smartphones and how that might have been different, let's call it 20 years ago or so.
I was an early adopter of the Aura Ring and found that the very narrow use case. What was the build pattern? The build pattern was find a very narrow use case and solve for that one use case really well in a very small form factor. So minimalist rather than maximalist approach. And trying to replicate the whole phone is the maximalist approach. Solving for one very narrow thing was the minimalist. I think the minimalist is the right structure for a wearable. Different point is that if I had to bet, I would rather bet on an environmental piece of hardware rather than a wearable piece of hardware, meaning something that's in the room rather than something that's on the body. And the contrast for the Aura Ring would be the 8 Sleep, which is a mattress cover that you put on your bed. They both measure very similar things, your HRV, your REM sleep, etc. So you get very similar output measurements and graphs from the environmental 8 Sleep that you get from the wearable Aura Ring. I think the environmental ones are the safer, better play. You aren't subject to all of the expectations that you're mentioning, Damon, here with the iPhone comparison. And instead, you're purely complementary to the existing tech, not trying to replace any existing tech.
Are you still using the Aura Ring, Shashi, or have you found your kind of participation in that to decline?
Yeah, I found this. I don't have to think about charging my 8 Sleep. I don't have to think about whether it's I don't have to do any maintenance there. I don't have to put it on and off at the right time. It's just there. So I've substituted Oura Ring for Eat Sleep.
Great. Okay. Sorry, Lexi, go ahead.
Yeah. I don't know. Have you like followed anything about the Meta smart glasses, Shashi? They're I haven't like seen them myself, but at least from what I've read, apparently they're like a very, very impressive piece of like wearable tech. Like the same categories like Humane AI Pin, like Rabbit has a camera in it, has a vocal assistant. Um, but like in there, like at least again, enthusiasm coming mostly from the tech like engineer, like futurist kind of space is very, very high. Just insofar as that like it's a product that doesn't require like a specialized adoption curve, right? Like you put your sunglasses on when you're going outside and that's the end of it, right? Um, but the take about like being an environmental is interesting. I think the one thing that's just like right now, all these devices exist in a place where the main thing they're assisting with is the internet, right? They're assisting with like searching and interacting with an app that exists in the web. Um, I think just like kind of the inherent problem is that like if you're going to ask for information or you're going to ask like order Uber or something, in general, those tasks are either so generic that like you could probably get them in a widget on a phone screen within like milliseconds, or you could get it like, or the specificity required is so intense that like you don't want to have to do like a back and forth to achieve that. I think as we kind of see like more systems capable of doing like engage with real world or like do really, really deep level of tasks, maybe the value goes up, but then you're also relying on the speed. It just feels a little bit early to put out a product that says like my role is interacting with the web and say that's the pitch of a hardware thing.
David and I have talked for years about a smart toilet. So what is this concept? The concept is no adoption curve. It's a data gathering device rather than an output device. I think the input, the data gathering feeding into is generally the right paradigm. And this is Damon's field. It's his PhD work, and he works in this kind of hardware already. So I just mentioned that as a specific example, the one that we've talked about for years as an environmental hardware piece that would be high value add and low adoption.
There's a Bass Connections at Duke that does like a smart toilet thing now. Like there is like existing like research groups working on that at Duke, yeah?
Yeah, Duke and other places. Like the smart toilet idea is not necessarily mine any more than it is just like seemingly an obvious solution that is very, very complicated to actually get to. I mean, for reasons that, I could describe in detail, but it's somewhat boring. It's very difficult to manage those. And to a larger point, why a lot of these companies start with on human devices is that's a much more controlled environment than simply trying to put something into the environment and having it have to deal with all the noise that comes from everything, including the human it's trying to interact with. To that point, the Meta glasses I actually really like as an idea because I just saw a promo recently. I'm not sure if this is coming to market soon or may already be there, but it's running a vision model. I don't know which vision model it was running, maybe GPT-4V, although I would be a little bit curious about kind of, conflicts of Meta versus OpenAI there. But one point being is they're obviously experimenting with the vision model. And actually, this is something that you and I have talked about in detail is this idea of integrating these generic or more generalist models over information coming from not the internet, right? Meaning information in the real world, whether that be images, video, or as Josh is describing from human health data, I'm saying things that are coming from the human body. So I think it's a fascinating space, but I do want to pull on a slightly tangential thread and Josh, you kind of alluded to it, so I'll pass this back to you in a moment. But this minimalist versus maximalist view. And so I want to set the stage and just ask the question kind of generically, how does a hardware startup give themselves the largest probability of success in kind of the current ecosystem where fundraising is challenging, it's long build cycles, it's a long way and a lot of money before you actually get to test your product with your, ultimate users. Even the early adopters, right, can't really get in early because you actually have to produce the thing. Then you have to very accurately estimate how many you should make, what your costs are going to be, and then how you actually eventually recoup that kind of upfront cost. So, Shasha, what do you think?
If it were me, I would start with a very low cost prototype, not pretty, demonstrate functionality, and then I would raise in the community. If you have relationships, you could raise 5 people that you know. There are crowdfunding sites where you can say, here's what I'm building, really excited about it. If you contribute financially to this project, you will get a certain benefit. And that might be access to the first batch of release product or swag, lots of ways to do that kind of early investor benefit. Crowdfunding can be hugely valuable. The product approach I would take is to go to the highest quality rather than the lowest price. So I would start high quality. If you start high quality, you can always go down in price. If you start low cost, it's very hard to climb the ladder to go up to high quality. So that would be my overall approach, is to start with what's the one very high quality narrow feature I can deliver, and just focus on nailing that, and then integration into the current ecosystem. What do these people already do? Do they use iPhones? Do they use some other set of software applications? What's their current environment? And how do I just make my feature integrate into the web of their current software and hardware seamlessly?
Do you think the play that has existed for the last 10 years of just hardware startups has been we produce a mobile app, we put that app out there, it interacts with your iPhone array, stores into Apple Health if it's a health wearable or something. And that's been the general way that these apps or these products function. They exist with a mobile app that comes with your phone, then you put them into the real world, right? Do you think what's the cutover point after which these devices stop being, you need to have a phone to get the full experience out of them? What do you think are the step changes necessary before we get there?
The way we operate today is that our primary interface is visual, and it's primarily the phone. By the way, I think the most healthy psychologically, and therefore the one that ends up winning over the 10-year plus horizon, is the one that is the least interruptive. So coming back to the reference of the Ray-Ban or the Meta glasses, I think that visual AR, the augmented reality layer, is actually a distraction that I would suggest is not going to be the winner. I think the one that wins is the least interruptive of your attention and the least interruptive of your trajectory, while complementing and supplementing you when and where you need it. So I think human psychology will end up preferring that. We may go through some cycles where we prefer the AR first and then evolve away from it. But overall, I would think that the least interruptive fits the best with how humanity operates, our native process, which helps us reintegrate with our people, the people in our lives, our kids around us, our friends. We get to be present with them. I think there's a huge, huge value to technology getting out of the way and letting us be present with the people we're with. In terms of how do we transition to that, I think we need some primary interface change that gets out of the way, and how that goes from the phone to something else, no one knows. But I think that will have to happen over, let's call it, the next 10 years for that transition, for complementary hardware to also make that transition.
I think I largely agree with that. I think that the immersive experience will have a time and a place, and they will be just that. They will be immersive experiences in which you're either experiencing them individually. So think about kind of the Sphere, in Las Vegas experience in an AR, VR glasses, but you're just sitting in kind of your basement like you would be watching a solo movie, right? That feels to me like a very real thing that could be done. Similarly, you could share that experience with somebody not physically with you. So it feels like, just like we are communicating via video chat here, feels like there's a much more kind of an additional layer that can be built onto those experiences to make you actually feel like you're kind of more connected with people than you otherwise would be. But I actually completely agree with your central thesis there, Shashi, which is, as we live our day-to-day lives, we are going to gravitate towards technology that is least invasive so that we can kind of interact with the world. So it does feel like in that space, the pen or a similar idea may have some room to run, but I think you're right. We may be 2 or 3 innovation cycles away from that actually kind of, gaining significant traction across people. So it's also a little bit, I think the question I would ask that it feels like the elephant in the room here is, why AI Pin not AI integrated smartwatch. Like we're already kind of almost wearing these things on our wrist. Like I'm a little bit confused as to why we need a form factor. I realized why in the short term, because they want a camera that is kind of point of view facing, such that when you're recording things, you're doing it, in something that's much more similar to your eyesight versus something that's sitting on your wrist. That is completely understood. But I guess the question, it still isn't clear in my mind as to why the smartwatch doesn't kind of ultimately become the form factor for these kind of complementary or even standalone AI devices, right? Because we're already seeing the Apple Watch kind of become that when we're hiking, diving, doing things we don't want our phones in our pockets for. Right? They can run cellular connections, they can connect to satellites and Bluetooth and do all these things. Like, feels to me like that's the most natural extension, but time will tell, I suppose. So, any closing thoughts on this hardware discussion before we kind of do a pivot?
Yeah, I will. Kevin just shared in company Slack that Apple has their own like local LMs for like apparently officially like published in papers. So what you just described may be coming sooner rather than later. I think the one of the like, I mean, of course, this is something that just comes up in every single review is that like most of these devices as they exist right now are calling like ChatGPT as an API, right? And that's fine and all, but you're always adding server latency to it. And now like especially where the problem is that like sitting there, tap, take photo, please analyze photo, come back to me is proving to be like a hitch in like the overall user experience and adoption cycle. Apple has already been very, very fantastically positioned to create their own hardware, run fantastic chips on these little tiny devices. And so we'll see. One of the largest companies in the world. Surely they can't do that bad a job, right?
Do you trust them to do? I mean, look at how bad Siri is. After how many years have they had to make Siri even basically functional? And it's a hot pile of garbage. And my kids joke about how bad Siri is all the time.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like it's just like if Apple, it's never felt to me that beyond like the first release, Siri is something that Apple's like, this is like our sailboat, like this is the thing we have to keep polished and super nice. I think just given the current like wave of hype that might be coming. I mean, like Apple's also like really like Apple just puts so much polish into things that like the Apple Vision Pro came like it followed up on a cycle that was pretty late in like regards like the headset space, right? That took them a while to get to. But when they did, well, like when they got there, like it was a very polished product. How well it was used, I don't know. But it does feel to me like an announcement regarding like a big Siri upgrade is probably coming within the year. As to like how impressive that actually ends up being, like does Apple follow along with all this stuff happening with like agentic and multi-agent to execute action, all that sort of stuff? We'll see. If they do, like, and if they like are watching what's currently happening and they're just like taking their time to work it out, like I trust that like Siri will probably be pretty insane in like 5 years. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. I hate when I ask a question, it's just like, oh, here are like 17 Wikipedia articles for you to click through on your own. Like, okay.
My feeling is similar in that Siri is, I think, objectively a poor service relative to any other service. But I do feel, at least from the outside looking in, like that was a lack of priority in Apple, not because something they can't fundamentally execute on. Time will tell. I just, as these technologies become more and more ubiquitous, it does feel like the advantage might be created in the hardware layer just to speed inference, just to have on-device kind of results being kind of driven. So it does feel like Apple's going to be well positioned in that space should that kind of play out.
I do feel like, at least for a lot of these hardware startups, like kind of what Shashi was alluding to, where like unless you're very niche and specific, if you're trying to compete in the space of like we are general purpose compute that lives like in the space of being able to be carried around, I don't feel like that has a very significant end game, because to me, at least for a good while, it sounds like it's always going to be tied to like you need your phone to get the full suite of features in here. Or rather, even just like, for example, like the Apple Watch is used for health reasons, but you don't look at your health profile on the watch, you look at it in the phone, right? Unless that changes, I don't see like a very strong end game unless one of these companies has like some very, very severe IP that makes them say like, okay, we are so far ahead of the curve and our adoption rate is just very, very high. all of a sudden, like Apple should be a little bit worried about not being the number one player in the space because we are so early and so advanced. I just think we're exactly there yet with any of them so far.
Agreed. That was great. Thanks for indulging the conversation there, you two. Okay, let's pivot slightly into some more recent news that was released within the last few days. That Moderna, obviously one of the major players in biotechnology, specifically vaccines and others, have adopted, or at least are seeming to begin initial adoption of a swarm of GPTs they have built inside of their organization. So I want to set the stage for a conversation about how we think this is going to play out more broadly, how we can see this idea of GPTs as a specialization layer on top of a foundation model, where we think there might be advantages to going with that approach if we think this is a replicable model across other major organizations who might have access to this type of thing, and then are there startup services that might be able to service this kind of niche. So, Lexi, I'm going to start with you this time. Number one, what do you think about Moderna's use of GPTs inside of the organization, and how do you think that extends to the practicality of others doing the same, doing something similar? If what does that similar look like? So feel free to take that away.
Yeah, the thing that was most surprising me, to be honest, is like, of course, with like a massive organization like that, partnering with OpenAI, obvious, like it's a good maneuver. OpenAI takes the money, builds systems for you. I think what was most surprising to me is that like the declared version of their adoption was just ChatGPT Enterprise. A lot of the cases that we've heard about before between these like big enterprise partnerships with OpenAI and like an existing firm has always been like, we're going to help you guys fine tune a model. We're going to help you like pull something off. But this is very simply like, yeah, they had like a mass subscription to ChatGPT for ChatGPT Enterprise. I think the thing that was like especially surprising, and maybe it's just because I wasn't thinking about it before, but it's interesting at the bare minimum to me that their adoption was just creating GPTs. It wasn't like internally developed tool that talks to OpenAI or something and has like all of their like server on-prem stuff managed. It's very literally just like same sort of style as what we're building, where it's like primarily like most of our like IP lives in API. We're just using ChatGPT as like an interface, basically. I think that caught me by like a pretty severe surprise, because to me that's kind of a signal that at least in like the space of enterprise like adoption of these tools, like the chatbot interface is one that's very much here to stay. It's one that like 750 GPTs have been developed internally. Some of them might be just employees like prompting like, hey, I'm like a drug researcher, I need you to look specifically for these things. But they allude to like some of them are like, they have some internal software that helps them optimize like drug doses for clinical trials. They have internal services for regulatory issues, right? And if their APIs are designed well enough, you're just slapping those into the GPT interface and just using OpenAI's visual UI UX to do 90% of whatever that professional work you're trying to do is. I think one thing that's interesting to me is like most of the superpower in there is just, of course, whatever Moderna's already developed. Like they had some API that does drug dose like prediction. They had some API that does regulatory stuff. But what this means for like the smaller companies that 100% doesn't have something like that, where what they're doing is probably like Excel sheets and Google Drives, where they're managing all this sort of stuff on their own. ChatGPT, its superpowers kind of come out when you're able to connect tools into them. But the thing that doesn't scale at the moment is it's hard to make a tool if you don't already have it, especially if you're not like a tech first organization.
Josh, any thoughts on that?
If I were Moderna, I would not trust OpenAI with my sensitive data. And while it may be behind an API, I would be deeply mistrustful of it. And here's my thought process. We've seen in the research papers that at scale, at a certain scale of hardware and of data, that large language models are essentially the same. They're on parity in terms of performance. Yes, there's a little bit of difference in terms of tuning that generates different benchmark performance for one test or another. But in the main, at scale, large language models perform about the same when confronted with large amounts of data and hardware. So with that said, how does OpenAI progress? It progresses by getting more data than competitors. This is, at least I can only surmise, this is a pathway. The enterprise data is a pathway for OpenAI to get more data than Llama, more data than Mistral, than knowing that that's the incentive function for ChatGPT to get better, I would be worried about being a large enterprise giving OpenAI or any model my data for training. That could be used as part of a future training data set. I would suggest that the value in the AI industry is a barbell, such that the bottom of the tech stack, the data centers, the chips, the servers, the hardware, will always have value, continue to have value. I think the foundational models and the dev tools are very difficult to build defensible value in today. And I think the end user application, the end user final product that gives them the entirety of their need. For example, you choose a customer, any customer, Moderna, you give them a full scope solution for that specific user inside Moderna. I think that has long lasting value with all of the components of that solution being interchangeable over time as those components get better. But really, that end user application that delivers the fullness of their requirements having long-term lasting value. So I see it as a barbell. End user has value, hardware, tech has value. The stuff in the middle, I think, has relatively less value and is highly competed away over time. So that's my overall view of it. I think, in terms of Moderna's bet on this, I think there's a certain amount of show in public that we're doing something about AI. I think there's a sort of a PR component to this. I think there's also an exploratory R&D component to this of just seeing what AI can do for us. How much more efficient can we get if we use AI? But I think that comes with risks when exposing your data.
Yes, I think more data ends up being the advantage in a lot of cases. I think one thing that's like to me is interesting is that a lot of I feel like LMs are hitting some level of a plateau, right? Like there's a distance that they can go to which like the version GPT-7 and GPT-8 might not look that different. I think the one thing that the data that's not being supplied in it to like match the demand enables these like I guess these AI first companies to go wider in what their models do rather than deeper, right? Like we've seen that like agents are already capable of like decent levels of reasoning. They're not perfect. We know like benchmarks, like we want you to code, we want you to do math, we want you to answer medical questions, and they still have a long way to go. That's fine. I think the one thing that I think that like stood out to me in Shashi's comment, which is not necessarily like a direct reply to it, is just that I think there is a set of data that's not being supplied currently to feed the next generation of models, meaning the ones that go multimodal that are not just text, right? Because I think like if you were to look at like benchmarks on GPT-4 today, right, there's probably something for like someone's made a like drug, a pharmaceutical benchmark, or like, hey, help me correct this drug information or tell me like what is the intended efficacy of this in these circumstances, right? That'll probably end up in the reasoning of some model like a 5 or a 6. But I think where the biggest delta ends up being is in the data types that aren't readily available so far, right? We don't have a lot of video. We don't have a lot of images, especially when you get super niche, right? Video, if you look at it, is like just relative to the like most of the AI generation space is so far behind, right? AI like video quality, like Sora is doing like 3 to 5 second videos at best. And they're all like generally pretty good. Like they're realistic, but they're not like human standard yet, if that makes sense, right? I think all of that to kind of say, I think the concern is valid. Contractually, I'm not sure how much like OpenAI can really do with these agreements. But that being said, I do think there is like, I would not be surprised if there's stuff happening in there where we have novel data types. Pharmaceuticals are providing like something more than just text that can be used to build models. And somewhere in their agreement, there might be like an OpenAI model tuned for pharma somewhere out there. I think that to me is like where the competitive edges come up, especially that OpenAI like already owns text, they already own video, or rather are the leaders in it. What happens when you have them also leading the spearhead of drug development, also leading the spearhead of models that are capable of all sorts of things that can interact with their existing video, their existing like physics sim, their existing text generation?
Yeah, I think I almost wonder, based on what you were saying, Shashi, about if there's a win-win scenario there. Like if maybe Moderna is happy to volunteer their data to OpenAI, assuming that they're getting some material benefit from that, either in the form of compensation or in the form of a fine-tuned model. So much as fine-tuning may make a difference for some of their applications. I don't know. I think it's interesting. The thread that I would rather pull at, though, in that is, do you think that there's a risk in those companies kind of co-building with the foundation models? And is that risk similar or different to those companies co-building with an application layer company? And do you kind of see a discrepancy between those two different models, or do you think that in general, going down the enterprise pathway poses some unknown currently security risk in any and all cases?
Without seeing the contract and the key terms, it's hard to know what level of exposure and upside. What you're asking is, what is the risk reward for each party? And what I can only surmise is that there is upside for OpenAI in having industry-specific data that they care about. They have a reason to prioritize this set of data, and there's a risk-reward function that works for them. Moderna must also have a risk-reward function that works for them, at least to the extent that they see the risks, that the risks are visible to them. And what I was suggesting in the earlier comment is perhaps the risks are a little bit greater than they may assume, given that they're using an API, because the training data could come directly from the inference. So the inference output itself could be interesting training data. But in terms of working with another organization that's not a foundational model, I think the risks are a lot less, because there's just not an incentive to train a model on your data and offer that to others. I think it's just easier to protect when there's not a foundational model in play.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Catching that conversation for a moment and kind of taking this in a slightly different direction, but still under the kind of GPT umbrella, do you think, Lakshay specifically, this is a model that can be replicated for, let's call it, small and medium businesses? Because as you alluded to earlier, you think the kind of secret sauce of this relationship working is Moderna's kind of internal capacity to build APIs, for lack of a better term, that can be supported by the interoperability of these large language models. And so how do you think that translates, or maybe doesn't translate kind of on surface level, to small, medium size businesses?
Yeah, I mean, we've even I've never looked at what ChatGPT Enterprise looks like, but it seems like it's still pretty representative of what the normal paid user uses, where you can see the full ChatGPT store. We've gotten an email or two before about just hey, what's the privacy level of your stuff? Because we're a team of people in ChatGPT Enterprise that want to use ScholarAI pretty regularly. I think that sort of model stands up. I think the place that is interesting and still kind of poorly defined is if you are a small medium company, let's say you're in pharma, right? Very small, very lean for the most part. Tech is not the thing you're building. APIs are not the thing you're building. You're not hiring software engineers for the most part for what you're doing, unless you happen to be some kind of AI pharma startup or something, right? In general, I think GPT is fine and nice alone, and a lot of people use it alone for very, very general purposes. But if you're going to look at the space of productivity, enterprises, knowledge domains that are super specific, it just does not hold that much water in just regards to this has value to me as a product, right? Someone from a small pharma company is not coming to GPT and asking hey, tell me about the history of this drug, right? That's a question it can answer. It's not going to be able to tell you are you on the right track with the work you're doing, right? I think there is going to be opportunity in helping smaller and medium-sized businesses just functionalize or even create APIs for the stuff that they have internally. But I think even in there comes the hard problem of how legacy are the systems you're using, how tech forward is the business generally. Do they have a sort of suite of things in their tool belt currently that migrating to a GPT first platform is something that they could do very easily if they wanted to? I'd assume in a lot of cases the answer is probably no. But I think there's opportunity for plenty of folks in trying to find hey, we're going to help pharma, we're going to help law, we're going to help construction, whatever. And saying these are very old, antiquated systems. The earth is kind of moving beneath us. We're going to help you move to the next age.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think we're seeing a lot of AI companies kind of be almost services masquerading as software right now, simply that they're just going in, they're engaging with customers, or trying to figure out what do you need to kind of, move your business, move your operations into the AI era, if you will. I mean, I think we're going to continue to see that play out. So I think that's really well said. And I think that's a great place to close this podcast, and we'll pick up that conversation as it kind of develops over the next few weeks. So thanks everybody for joining us for this week's episode of the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Please find us at all the typical podcast locations. Remember to leave your comments in the section below on our YouTube channel, and we will get to some of those in some following episodes. Thanks so much, and see you all next week.